Joining me now is William Wright, Managing Director for GovConnex in the UK, who's burning the midnight oil for us. William, appreciate your time. So, look, I guess some of these surprises or these mentions are not a surprise. Any catch your eye, though, or have you raised your eyebrows?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, Tom. So, look, at GovConnex, we, for our clients, track essentially the key political issues and topics that they're interested in. We're looking at what politicians are saying, whether that be on social media and press releases or across the Hansard. And so, yeah, our political trends report this year has produced some interesting results, particularly in Australia. So housing and housing affordability is the number one most mentioned issue in Australian federal parliament. 67% of those mentions have come from Greens, independents, or the government itself. Again, traditionally, those are the electorates with the high proportion of renters, although that is shifting slightly. Number 2 and 3, as you can see on the screen there, were business and taxation. Cost of living itself was number 4, and then health was number 5. So really, it has been a cost of living year in politics in Australia, and those top 4 issues are loosely all about the same thing. If you compare that to the UK, so we did look at Westminster, the NHS and health is actually number 1. Education comes in 3. If you look at New Zealand, health is also number 1. But then the Treaty Principles Bill also comes in top 5. So really for Australia, it has been all about cost of living.
Interesting, isn't it? Because you've seen inflation very much peak in those other countries, so you can see Australia's in the mix. And we did note as well, it was a bit of a tricky one to display, but massive spikes in cost of living right around the time of the RBA making decisions on rates. So, you know, that goes to show that people are going, oh, please give us some relief. It doesn't happen. Israel-Palestine, look, it's been a huge topic, but perhaps not a huge surprise. The Greens, not many MPs, but they're dominating the mentions here of this conflict and ongoing issue.
No, exactly right. So if you look at mentions of either Israel or Palestine across federal parliament, 26% come from the coalition, 24% from the government. So they're relatively split there, but a massive 42% actually come from the Greens themselves. As you rightly point out, not many MPs. If you do take that a step further and you look at the top 10 most vocal representatives on the term genocide, all 10 of them are Greens MPs. If you then look at the top 10 most vocal on anti-Semitism, the vast majority are coalition MPs, led by Senator Henderson with 136.
Nuclear energy is really taking off with the coalition unveiling its policy, but it's a Labor figure mentioning it by far the most in Australian politics.
Yeah, so Chris Bowen has mentioned it 215 times. They are all essentially negative mentions. Again, we're looking at the trends of this, and I imagine you would have been speaking about this a lot this week, Tom. But yeah, leading into next year's election, it's going to be a big topic. Mentions did actually peak in June when the sites of the coalition's proposed plants were announced, but we've seen a big uptick recently. We expect that to continue across and into the next election. You did just display on the screen there the mentions and comparing that to the UK. In the UK, they do actually have operational nuclear power plants. They're also building them, but there still has only been 645 mentions. Compare that to the mass over 4,000 in Australia.
Yeah, huge figure. You're sort of tracking as well some of the things a bit less mentioned. There's no lack of war. We haven't had wars, you know, the major ones end when you think of Gaza expanding temporarily at least into Lebanon, and Ukraine rolls on, but the mentions have dropped a bit.
Yeah, so it's a really interesting trend. There is no shortage of war, but mentions of war across federal parliament are down 77%. So whether they think that the electorate is growing tired of hearing about it, I'm not sure. That's what the data says. Some other interesting downward trends as well. So mentions of natural disasters and climate change are trending downwards. And that's been a trend we've seen since 2020. So you look for people like the Teal Independents who had quite a significant amount of success at the last election. They'll be wanting to bring that back onto the agenda. So we'll certainly track that. Some other interesting ones we've seen, I mean, mentions of King Charles, 10% of all mentions of King Charles this year in Australian federal parliament related to Lydia Thorpe and her protest. And Charles essentially got the same amount of mentions as Taylor Swift. So you can make of that what you will.
There you go. Slightly sort of different topics, but I guess they both fit into that sort of talking point area. Just quickly, UK polls over there, because the UK government sort of going through that mantra of making the tough decisions early. How much is that being reflected in polling with not so long ago that pretty strong election victory?
Yeah, so an election in July, it's been a relatively short-lived honeymoon period for the Starmer government. The polls are really interesting. It's worth keeping one eye on the UK because Nigel Farage's reform is now polling in the mid-20s, essentially the same number as you're seeing the Tories and the Labor Party polling over here. And, you know, when we go to Labor events here and Conservative events, you speak to MPs, you speak to Lords, that there is a genuine concern amongst them that they might be breaking the two-party mold a little bit. There's an election in Wales in a couple of months. That would be worth watching because Reform seems to be polling well there as well.
Okay. Yeah, well, that was a big watch, wasn't it, in the federal election, as you say, not that long ago. William Wright, thank you. We'll be touching base again, of course, next year as we head to our own federal election in the next 6 months.